Beyond the Occult: The Astonishing Conclusion to the Occult Trilogy by Colin Wilson. Introduction. My serious interest in the paranormal began 20 years ago in the late 1960s when an American publisher asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about the occult, a subject that had achieved immense popularity ever since a book called The Morning of the Magicians by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Berger had sold over 1 million copies in France in 1960. I accepted in a fairly light-hearted spirit. Like most people, I'd always enjoyed reading speculations about Atlantis, the Loch Ness Monster, and the ghosts of Borley Rectory, and had accumulated a fairly large library of second-hand books and cheap paperbacks on such matters. But I had another reason for accepting. For many years I'd been possessed by a strong conviction, amounting to a certainty, that all human beings possess hidden powers. Some of these powers came under the general heading of extrasensory perception. I had suffered my wife's birth pangs and on one occasion experienced her toothache. One close family friend had described how she found herself floating up above her body during a serious illness, while another had foreseen a traffic accident, a collision, with another taxi at least a minute before it happened. But it was not this type of hidden power that really interested me. I was even more fascinated by those strange moments of pure joy in which we experience an almost godlike sensation of power or freedom. The following, for example, is taken from a friend's account of an illumination that happened when he was hitchhiking around the world in 1964. I had been through a great deal of emotional turmoil and privation during my travels and arrived at the port of Limassol in Cyprus with great relief at having left the scenes of my suffering behind me. One evening I was sitting gazing vacantly at the sea in the afterglow of sunset, having just finished a meal in a little Greek eatery, feeling very tranquil and relaxed, when I began to feel a strange pressure in my brain. It was as if some deliciously loving hand had slipped numbingly under my skull and it was pressing another brain on top of mine. I felt a thrilling liquidity of being and an indescribable sensation, as if the whole universe was being poured into me, or perhaps rather as if the whole universe was welling up out of me from some deep center. My soul thrilled and swelled, and my consciousness passed out across the ocean and the land in all directions, through the sky and out into space. Within moments I was among the stars and planets and strange entities of space. Somehow I was aware of great beings, millions of miles high, moving in space, through which the stars could be seen. Wave after wave of revelations swept through my whole being, too fast for my normal mind to record other than the joy and wonder of it. I had never experienced anything as overwhelming as this, but ever since childhood I had been prone to drift into those moods of intense happiness and affirmation that the psychologist Abraham Maslow calls peak experiences. One of the most vivid had occurred when I was 19 and was hitchhiking my way across France to Strasbourg. A lorry driver had given me a lift to a little routier, and I had eaten a hot meal and drunk a glass of wine. So far, I found it rather a strain being in a foreign country with very little money, but as I walked out of the routier and looked across the rolling countryside to the mountains in the distance, I experienced a feeling of joy that was so complete that all the problems of my life vanished into insignificance. It was like a shift of viewpoint, as if I had suddenly left my body and was looking down on my own life. No doubt the wine had something to do with it, but that is beside the point. So for what I experienced, it was not just a feeling, but a seeing. Once again, as on so many other occasions, I could see that the real problem of human beings is that we live too close up to life, like a short-sighted painter who has to paint with his nose within an inch of the canvas. And that close-upness deprives us of meaning. We accept this as inevitable, for after all, we are men, not birds, and modern life requires constant attention to detail. But the moments of vision reveal that this assumption is a mistake. Apparently, we possess a faculty that can instantly distance us from present reality, just as the short-sighted painter could. If he wanted to stand back from the canvas and put on a pair of strong glasses, If we could learn to call on this faculty at will, our lives would be transformed, for we waste 90% of our time in coping mechanically with minor problems and vastly overestimating them. And if many people could learn to do it, our earth itself would be transformed. For most of the ugliness and the evil of our lives is due to stress and close-upness. Perhaps the most important aspect of these moments of vision is that they suggest that there is a way of acquiring knowledge that is quite unlike the ordinary method of learning from experience. When the visionary faculty is switched on, the mind seems to be able to penetrate reality, rather in the manner of X-rays, and to grasp meanings that normally elude it. In 1969, a man named Derek Gibson was traveling to work by motorcycle when he noticed that the sound of his engine had faded to a murmur. Then everything suddenly changed. I could clearly see everything as before, with form and substance, but instead of looking at it all, I was looking into everything. I saw beneath the bark of the trees and through the underlying trunks. I was looking into the grass, too, and all was magnified beyond measure, to the extent that I could see moving microscopic organisms. Then not only was I seeing all of this, but I was literally inside it all. At the same time as I was looking into the mass of greenery, I was aware of every single blade of grass and fold of the trees as if each had been placed before me one at a time and entered into. My world became a fairyland of vivid greens and browns, colors not seen so much as felt. Instantly also my mind was not observing, but was living what it was registering. I did not exist. Power and knowledge surged through my mind. The words formed in me. I can remember clearly, now I know. There is nothing I could not answer. I am a part of all of this. A similar revelation had come to the Protestant mystic Jacob Boehme in the year 1600. This is how his biographer, Bishop Hans Martensen, describes it. Sitting one day in his room, his eye fell upon a burnished pewter dish, which reflected the sunshine with such marvelous splendor that he fell into an inward ecstasy, and it seemed to him as if he could now look into the principles and deepest foundations of things. He believed that it was only a fancy, and in order to banish it from his mind, he went out into the green fields. But here he noticed that he could gaze into the very heart of things, the very herbs and grass, and that actual nature harmonized with what he had inwardly seen. It seems obvious that Derek Gibson and Jacob Boehme had the same basic experience, and that therefore it is some perfectly normal faculty that might be activated at any time in any one of us. It is as if the human race is colorblind, as most animals are, and a few men suddenly develop color vision. It also seems clear that there is a close link between these mystical experiences and the faculty labeled extrasensory perception. For example, the Russian newspaper Izvestia reported in June 1987 the case of a woman named Yulia Vorobyeva, 37, who was pronounced dead after receiving a 380-volt electric shock in March 1978. She recovered after 2 days in the morgue, but was unable to sleep for the next 6 months. Then she sank into a long sleep and woke to discover that she had acquired paranormal powers. I went shopping one morning. I got to the bus stop and a woman was standing there. Suddenly I was struck by horror. I thought I could see right through this woman, like a television screen. When Izvestia's reporter interviewed her, she looked at his stomach and told him correctly what he had for lunch. Within seconds of meeting a doctor, she was able to tell him that one ear was weaker than the other, and that the same was true of his eyes. Significantly, Vorobyeva also states that she can see ultraviolet rays from the sun. This could offer a clue to her X-ray vision. The human eye is only able to see light of wavelengths of between 16 and 32 millionths of an inch, violet and red respectively. Nature has apparently decided that it would serve no purpose for the eye to detect energy of wavelengths longer than 32 millionths, heat and microwaves, or shorter than 16 millionths, ultraviolet and X-rays. But we might regard these limits as more or less arbitrary. In 1828, a youth named Caspar Hauser walked into Nuremberg with bleeding feet, and it soon became clear that he had been kept captive in a darkened room since birth. Physicians who examined him discovered that as a result he was able to read aloud from the Bible in a completely dark room and see the heat from a stove long before it had become red hot. Vorobiev seems to have developed the power to see energy from beyond the other end of the spectrum, including ultraviolet and X-rays. One result, according to Ivestia, is that she can see through the asphalt surface of a road to the soil underneath. It is easy enough to understand why human beings do not possess X-ray eyes. They would simply complicate our lives without enhancing our power of survival. If we are to live with maximum efficiency, our lives need to be as simple as possible. If a human being could somehow get inside a frog's head, he would be astounded at the crude simplicity of its world. Experiments have shown that the frog's eyes pass on only very limited information to its brain, a simplified picture of its surroundings, moving shadows, which might be enemies, and edible objects like flies. Everything else is ignored. Humans are more complicated because they need to be in order to survive, but anything that has no survival value is filtered out by the senses. There is strong evidence that we have also filtered out various powers that our ancestors once possessed. The tiger hunter, Jim Corbett, author of Man-Eaters of Kuman, explains how he has developed a faculty which he calls jungle sensitiveness, which has often saved his life when a tiger had been lying in wait. But such a faculty would obviously be useless to a stockbroker. There is also much evidence, which we shall consider later, that animals and primitive people possess far more highly developed powers of extrasensory perception than civilized human beings. We do not need them, therefore we have discarded them, or rather we put them into cold storage, to be recovered as needed, as, for example, by Jim Corbett when stalking tigers. Caspar Hauser and Yulia Vorobiev seem to suggest that our brains are wired up to perceive X-rays and infrared rays, but that we only rarely have to call these powers into operation. But now we come to the most baffling part. It is easy enough to see why man has discarded jungle sensitiveness and other simple forms of ESP. They are no longer essential to his survival, but moments of vision like those experienced by Muse Murray and Derek Gibson are an entirely different matter. Powers like these cannot have been essential to our survival at any point in our evolution. In fact, they seem to be a contradiction of the theory of evolution. If you think of the evolution of tiny microorganisms into amoebas, then into fishes, then into land animals, you can see that there was no point in our evolution when we needed the power to see into the heart of trees or to float out among the stars and planets in space. And the same applies to many more mundane faculties. Children known as calculating prodigies can perform incredible feats with numbers. A 5-year-old boy named Benjamin Blythe asked his father what time it was and was told 4:30. A few minutes later, the child said, "In that case, I've been alive," and named the exact number of seconds since his birth, about 158 million. His father worked it out on a sheet of paper and said, "No, you were wrong by 172,800 seconds. "No, I wasn't," said the child. "You forgot the 2 leap years." The obvious explanation for this is that our brains are wired up to calculate numbers, and some brains are better at it than others. After all, an ordinary abacus could calculate in billions and trillions if necessary, but that explanation simply fails to fit the facts. For example, there are certain numbers, known as primes, numbers that cannot be exactly divided by any other, like 5, 7, 13, 17, and so on. But there is no simple method of finding out whether a number is a prime except by dividing all the smaller numbers into it. So if a number is extremely large, there is no quick way of discovering whether it is a prime or not. Even a modern number would have to do it the hard way. Yet there are certain calculating prodigies who can do it almost instantly. The Canadian lightning calculator, Zira Colburn, was asked whether a certain 10-digit number was a prime or not. After a moment thought, he replied that it was not, because it could be divided by 641. Yet what he did was a logical impossibility. The psychiatrist Oliver Sacks has described a pair of subnormal twins in a New York mental hospital who amused themselves by swapping 24-figure primes. an even greater impossibility. The brain cannot be wired to perform such feats instantly. The twins must be arriving at their results by some non-logical process akin to mystical vision. Derek Gibson experienced the feeling, "There is nothing I could not answer." Once again, we confront the question, how could such powers have developed in the normal course of our evolution? Man began as an amoeba, then turned into a fish, then became an amphibian, then developed into a kind of rodent, then into an ape, then into a human being. There is no room in this process for a power of recognizing 24-digit primes. It is easy enough, of course, to explain how we might develop such a power at some future date. After all, the very word evolution implies an extension of our powers. What is so baffling is that we already appear to possess this power in a latent form. G.K. Chesterton would probably say that it proves that man is a fallen angel, rather than a risen ape. Whatever the explanation, it seems to fly in the face of common sense. Yet if we are willing to use a little imagination, we can begin to see at least the outline for an answer. As you are reading these words, try to recall what it was like when you first learned to read. The misery, the exasperation of trying to understand row upon row of squiggly little symbols. Recall how you occasionally felt as though you were suffocating and your head was bursting. Yet now you read almost as naturally as you breathe. That is because you have disciplined all those bursting energies, put them into harness, and tamed them as a rider tames a wild colt. Now the discipline has become quite unconscious, and you do not even notice it, unless the print is too small or you're feeling tired and impatient. For thousands of years, civilized man has been imposing a similar discipline on his senses, so that he no longer notices that he's wearing a saddle and a harness. In effect, he has learned to look at the world through a kind of microscope which shows him the immediate present with extreme clarity so that he can handle it with remarkable precision. But since his attention only has room for a small number of things at a time, he is obliged to forget 99% of his experience, or at least place in a kind of cold storage. Sherlock Holmes told Watson that he couldn't care less whether the earth went around the sun or vice versa. He said his mind was like an attic that could only store a certain number of facts. So if he admitted some new piece of information, he had to throw out an old one. Animals almost certainly have a far wider and more interesting form of consciousness, probably something closer to the consciousness of a slightly drunken man for whom the whole world is a marvelously warm and glowing place. The most obvious characteristic of mystical experiences is that it happens to relaxed people. Muse Murray was relaxing outside a Cypriot cafe. Boheme was staring at a pewter dish. Derek Gibson was following a familiar route in the early morning. In this state, it seems that the harness often slips off and allows us to experience something closer to the free, untrammeled consciousness of the animal or child with its glory and freshness. So instead of being aware of just one or two things, we glimpse the whole panorama of existence. The mentally subnormal twins, who can swap 24-digit primes, must somehow hover above the whole number field, like birds looking down on the landscape and seeing hills and lakes and villages all at a glance. In short, our chief limitation lies in our assumption that our narrow, tightly harnessed consciousness is normal and natural, whereas it is in fact highly abnormal and highly unnatural. The basic problem of human beings is simply an inability to get it all together. We possess all of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but it's so huge that we could never see it as a whole. The moment we learn to grasp this fact, we also begun to learn how to achieve the moments of vision at will, and how to gain control of our hidden powers. When I began systematic research for my book, The Occult, I must admit that my attitude was basically skeptical. As a child, I'd been fascinated by spiritualism, ghosts, and magic, and I devoured all the books in the occult section of our local library, from poltergeists to voodoo. But around the age of 11, my mother presented me with a chemistry set, and my uncle produced a book on astronomy, and I fell under the spell of the potent magic of science. Suddenly, the occult seemed absurd and slightly disgusting. Later on, when I decided I wanted to become a writer rather than a scientist, my attitude became less censorious, and I began to experience a certain nostalgia for the interests of childhood, such as murder and the supernatural. At 24, as the author of a successful book, I once began to accumulate a library on the supernatural. but I was inclined to treat it as a light summer read. I had no doubt whatever the most occultists are indulging in pure wishful thinking. As I began to study the subject systematically, this attitude soon changed. I was struck first of all by the impressive consistency of reports of telepathy, second sight, and precognition. If they were really lies or delusions, they ought to possess as much variety as a shelf full of novels. In fact, they all sounded remarkably similar. The same was true of reports of magic and contact with spirits. You would expect to find very little in common between the beliefs of an African witch doctor, an Eskimo shaman, and a Siberian medicine man. In fact, they are practically interchangeable. Invented ghost stories by writers like Dickens or M.R. James are full of the most weird diversity of occurrences. Real ghost stories all sound alike. It was soon obvious to me that I was not studying a subject full of imaginative inventions or impostures, but a fairly narrow range of facts, just as in astronomy or cybernetics. As a result, I soon became convinced that the evidence for poltergeists, premonitions, and second sight is as sound as the evidence for atoms and electrons. I wrote in the occult, I sympathize with the philosophers and scientists who regard it as emotional nonsense, because I am temporarily on their side, but I think they are closing their eyes to evidence that would convince them, if it concerned the mating habits of albino rats or the behavior of alpha particles. For someone trained as a scientist, the domain of the paranormal was like traveling to a foreign country. I found myself in a strange and exciting world that was also reassuringly consistent. It could be explored exactly like a foreign country by wandering around and studying what was to be seen. Admittedly, parts of it had to be treated with suspicion like any modern tourist trap. But in deciding what to believe and what not to believe, I applied exactly the same standards that I would apply in science. If something had been observed independently by a number of trustworthy observers, then I was inclined to accept it as fact. But some of these facts certainly left me feeling baffled. For example, a German doctor named Justinus Kerner spent 3 years studying a psychic lady called Friederike Hof, and had no doubt whatever she could read a book, had no doubt whatever that she could read a book that was placed face downwards against her bare stomach. By any normal scientific standards, this sounds absurd, yet it was observed many times by 19th century investigators. Professor Cesare Lombroso, a confirmed scientific materialist, studied a girl who could see through her ear and smell through her chin. The possibility that she was cheating vanished entirely when her sense of smell transferred itself back to her foot. If pleasant smells were brought close to her heel, she smiled, while unpleasant ones made her react with disgust. Lombroso also came across the case of a girl who developed X-ray vision and asserted that she could see worms in her intestines. She counted 39. Under treatment, she excreted exactly 33 worms. Another curious phenomenon that I came to accept as a fact was called community of sensation. When Alfred Russel Wallace, co-founder of the theory of evolution, was a young teacher, he became interested in hypnotism and experimented with a number of his pupils. When one of these pupils was in a trance, he could share Wallace's sense of taste and smell. When Wallace sucked a lump of sugar, the boy went through sucking motions. When Wallace tasted salt, the boy grimaced. When Wallace stuck a pin in himself, the boy jumped and rubbed the appropriate part of his body. Years later, when Wallace was chairman of a scientific committee, he received a paper from a young Irish professor named William Barrett, who had taken part in similar experiments and seen a young girl distinguish between various substances that the hypnotist put into his own mouth. So Wallace had no doubt that Barrett was telling the truth. The rest of the committee lacked Wallace's experience, and the paper was never published. But Wallace was so convinced that such matters deserved to be investigated that he became a founder member of the Society for Psychical Research. Since that time, community of sensation has been observed again and again by open-minded investigators. For example, Dr. Gustav Pagenstecher, a German physicist working in Mexico City, began to treat a patient called Maria de Zeerold soon after the First World War and discovered that he could cure her insomnia with hypnosis. When in a trance, Maria de Zerold's senses were apparently transferred to the hypnotist so that she could taste substances he put into his mouth, feel the burning of a match he held underneath his hand, and hear the ticking of his watch. And even though her eyes were closed, she could see him quite normally and describe the things he was doing, even in the next room. On the whole, then, most open-minded inquirers would agree that the community of sensation is a scientifically established fact. Only scientists continue to regard it as myth. The same applies to psychometry, the ability possessed by certain people to hold some object in their hands and read its history. In 1843, an American doctor named Joseph Rhodes Buchanan met Bishop Leonidas Polk, who told him that he could always distinguish brass, even in the dark, because when he touched it, he felt a brassy taste in his mouth. Buchanan decided to try this out on his pupils and was fascinated to discover that many of them could detect various substances with their fingertips, even when the substance had been swathed in thick brown paper. But his greatest surprise came when some of his best sensitives showed themselves able to hold a sealed letter in their hands and describe the person who had written it in precise detail. They were also able to sense the writer's mood. A disciple of Buchanan named William Denton, a professor of geology in Boston, began his own series of tests with geological specimens, rocks, meteorites, prehistoric bone fragments, and so on, and found that his best sensitives had very precise visions of the place where the object originated. Both Denton and Buchanan wrote long books describing their experiments, which excited widespread interest at the time. But scientists quickly lost interest in these wonders, particularly when psychometry, Buchanan's coinage meaning soul measurement, was taken up by spiritualists and occultists. Hundreds of well-documented cases leave little doubt that psychometry is one of the most commonest paranormal faculties. But science continues to ignore the subject, and even serious investigators of the paranormal seem to regard it with a kind of embarrassment. For example, Brian Inglis does not even refer to it in his comprehensive history of the paranormal, natural, and supernatural. All this should make it clear why, when I had finished writing The Occult in 1971, I had no doubt whatever that I was dealing with scientific actualities and not with the delusions of muddle-headed spiritualists. Even the most baffling of all paranormal faculties, precognition, the ability to glimpse the future, was so exhaustively documented that, again, there should be no possible doubt that it occurs again and again. So I arrived at the reasonable conclusion that human beings possess a whole range of hidden powers of which they are usually unaware, and that these include telepathy, second sight, precognition, and psychometry. It seemed fairly obvious that our ancestors possessed these faculties to a far higher degree, and that we have gradually lost them because we no longer need them. This seemed to be illustrated by the case of the Dutch clairvoyant Peter Hurkos, who became aware of his powers as a result of an accident during the Second World War, in which he fell off a ladder and cracked his skull. As he began to recover in the hospital, he found that he knew things about his fellow patients simply by looking at them. For example, that the patient in the next bed had sold a gold watch left to him by his father. But this was not simply telepathy, for when Hurkos shook hands with a patient who was about to leave, he suddenly knew that the man was a British agent and that he would be killed shortly. This insight almost cost him his life, for the Dutch resistance assumed that Hurkos was working for German intelligence, and it was only with that utmost difficulty that he convinced them that he possessed genuine powers of clairvoyance. But the most interesting point about the case of Hurkos is that after he left the hospital, he could not work at any normal job because he was unable to concentrate. It was not until he stumbled upon the idea of using his newly discovered powers as a stage magician that he was again able to start supporting himself and his family. This reveals clearly why man has suppressed his psychic abilities. They involve a kind of mental receptivity and openness that would make him far less efficient at everyday living. As I wrote The Occult, I experienced the pleasurable excitement of someone who sees fact after fact fall neatly into place. I imagine Newton must have felt something of the sort as he wrote the Principia, and this was the example that was at the back of my mind in writing The Occult and its sequel mysteries. It was breathtaking to realize that so many of the things I had regarded as superstitious absurdities had a sound basis in fact. And if they were factual, then they could be incorporated into some sort of scientific framework. And since I had started life as a scientist, my first book, written at the age of 13, had been a 7-volume manual of general science. It seemed a reasonable assumption that I might be the right person to do it. And indeed, when I came to reread the book in proof, I had a satisfying sensation of having created a comprehensive theory that explained the existence of paranormal faculties from a scientific viewpoint. It was as rigorous and logical as I could make it, and I felt that no one could accuse me of being credulous or gullible. The book had considerable success, and it was pleasant to walk into a big department store in my hometown and see a whole rack devoted to copies of the paperback. But even by that time I had begun to be troubled by doubts. The more I learned about the paranormal, the more I saw I was being absurdly optimistic in believing that I had covered all the basic facts. It was true that the unconscious mind seemed to provide a fairly convincing explanation for telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychometry, but it hardly seemed adequate to explain some of the highly convincing evidence for life after death, and even for reincarnation. And it totally failed to explain the experience of my musician friend who was traveling in a taxi along the Bayswater Road when he suddenly knew that another taxi would jump the traffic lights at the Queensway intersection and hit them sideways on. The fact that it was late at night and he was exhausted after playing at a concert could help to explain why he was in the right condition to receive the message from his unconscious mind. But how could his unconscious mind know about something that was going to happen in a minute or so, even if it could somehow see the other taxi approaching the traffic light and read the mind of the driver? He could still not know that there would be a collision. There can be no scientific explanation for precognition because it is obviously impossible to know about an event which has not yet happened. Yet my reading revealed that there are hundreds of serious, well-documented cases. It was at this point that I found an important clue in a book that had been presented to me by its author not long after publication of The Occult. It bore the intimidating title Towards a General Theory of the Paranormal, and it led me onto so many fresh clues and new insights that they will require a chapter to themselves. End of the introduction. Next chapter will be Chapter 1, Mediums and Mystics.